everyone. My name is Sara Siddiqi, and I'm the Advocacy Coordinator with SciSoc. I would like to thank you all for tuning in to this vaccine Q&A event, and we hope that this event will allow us to work towards improving vaccine literacy and that everyone tuning in will be able to pass this info on to others. Mackenzie, our wonderful Vice President Academic, will now introduce our speaker, Duale.
All right, thank you, Sara. We're so pleased to have newly minted Dr. Duale Ahmed here today. Born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Duale received his BSc in biochemistry from Carleton, and it was during his undergraduate studies that he was first exposed to laboratory research and decided to pursue research as a career. And then remaining at Carleton, Duale recently completed his PhD in biology, where he was investigating the role that cellular metabolism, and specifically the mitochondria, plays in the regulation of antiviral responses to macrophages. And now currently, Duale is working as a postdoctoral fellow in health sciences, where he is continuing his research into the role of metabolism in antiviral macrophage responses, as well as expanding his research into how mitochondrial diseases alter the normal macrophage immune responses to bacterial and viral pathogens. That is a very awesome field of research to be in right now, and we thank you so much for joining us today, Duale.
Thank you for having me. It's just a mouthful of saying I did a couple things here and there, so it's all good.
Yeah.
For this event, we have some questions regarding vaccines and how they work that we will be asking Duale. So Mackenzie, the floor is yours to ask the first question.
All right, so for our first question, we wanted to ask, how are the mechanistic actions of the vaccines available similar, and how are they different? So things like Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, J&J, how do they differ in their actual action?
So the way I like to describe it is that breaking up into two groups. So you have the Pfizer, Moderna, they represent the mRNA vaccines, whereas you have the AstraZeneca and the J&J or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they represent the adenovirus vector vaccines. And so essentially the Pfizer and Moderna, they use the mRNA technology where they basically deliver the mRNA to your particular cells. So normally when we go and get our shots, they put it right into your arm muscle. And so they have these little vesicles that capture the mRNA that then goes into the cells, absorbs into the cells, and that mRNA gets translated to produce particular protein of interest, which in this case is the spike protein that is found on the COVID-19 virus. That spike protein is on the surface of the virus, readily available and actually seen by your immune cells. As a result, your immune cells will theoretically build a response to that particular protein. And so in the context of the vaccine, that spike protein that gets produced actually gets expressed on the surface of the surrounding area. And what happens is your immune cells will then respond to that, recognizing, hey, that's not normal. And so they build a response to that particular protein, leading to the elimination of those cells that have that abnormal thing, so that next time they can have the memory to deal with it the next time around. That's the idea behind the vaccines. Whereas the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson, what they do is they have an adenovirus that has been rendered harmless by research that package the DNA that make also the spike protein. These adenoviruses will then deliver it to these cells surrounding the injection site, and they'll get incorporated, they'll be put into the cell will then produce the spike protein from that DNA, which then produces the spike protein, which then again, like the same process with the mRNA vaccine, goes to the surface of the cells, allowing the immune cells to recognize it, saying, hey, that's not normal, build a response to that, and thus have the memory to deal with it if they recognize it again. And so they're both two different ways of delivering the genetic information required to build a piece of the COVID-19 virus so that your immune cells can then build a response and have the memory of that response against it for future exposure.
Awesome. That's really helpful to think of them in like two different groups. So my next question, kind of along the lines of mechanism, is how is a vaccine immune response different from a natural infection immune response?
So Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, and then kind of like follow up to that also, but how is it the messenger RNA vaccine specifically effective in inducing immunity?
So the way so to answer the latter part of the question, I'm going to talk about the adenovirus first because it's going to lead back into answering both parts of those questions. So the adenovirus is packaged within it has the DNA. That DNA is responsible or has the genetic information required to produce that spike protein, right? And so it gets injected into the cells by the virus. The cell machinery within it will go through transcription and translation to produce the mRNA, and then that mRNA will then produce the protein, which then goes to the surface of the cell in order to allow your immune cells to produce that response. Now, the mRNA vaccine skips that first part of the process, skips that transcription process, because it already provides the mRNA to the cells in order to produce the protein. And so think of the mRNA as of basically just skipping the line to try to get to that endpoint. Now, when it comes to essentially the difference between a natural infection versus the vaccine infection, the natural infection is essentially responding to the whole virus. So all pieces of the virus, the genetic material, the proteins on the surface, all of it. And normally when you are sick, you're usually exposed to larger loads of that virus. And so usually your immune response are also stronger compared to a vaccine where researchers are trying to identify what amount of the vaccine, the smallest amount of the vaccine possible in order to produce a response without having any side effects, right? Because they have to balance that. Because if the vaccine does more harm than good, you start to have a lot of people questioning science, which is kind of happening right now for whatever. Whole different issue. We can talk, we don't have to talk about that, but we can talk about that. But the point being is researchers are trying to identify that sweet spot where you have enough vaccine there to produce a proper response, but not too much to have any side effects if there were to be side effects. And so typically, well, theoretically, a natural immune response to natural infection, while they produce a stronger response, the thing is, there's also the side effects. There's also the long-lasting effects that could come about from that infection process, right? Whereas the vaccine doesn't really have that. So I don't know about you, but I'm not trying to get whatever damage that is associated with an infection where I can simply take the vaccine and not deal with any long-term effects from that.
Yeah, thank you, Duale. I really like how you broke that down as kind of like attaching one to the other. And it's interesting that while the natural infection can be stronger, it's, it's the cost risk benefit analysis of it. And that's why vaccines are such an amazing technology, right? Because they kind of eliminate that risk.
Exactly, right? You're able to provide the cells the training it needs in order to deal with that response so that if you ever come in contact with it, you don't get the most adverse or severe effects from it. And so it's, yes, theoretically, sure, you want to go through the natural infection process, sure. But do you realize how much pain and suffering you're going to have to go through to deal with all of that? And there's also a chance you can die. And I'm not trying to die.
Fair point. Definitely fair point. Along the lines of immunity, the next question is asking about the 2-week period that we hear a lot about after your vaccine. So why is there this 2-week period after vaccination that you need to be considered fully vaccinated? And kind of along the same lines of that, why do we need 2 doses in order to elicit like the best immune response?
So that's a very good question. So the 2-week period is essentially comes back to the immune response cycle takes about 2 weeks to go through. And so the reason why there's this 2-week period or 2-week lag between injections or between the vaccination point until when you're fully protected is so that your body can actually go through that full cycle. So if you think about your immune response, your first line of defense is the innate immune system, your dendritic cells, macrophages, so on and so forth. They recognize the initial threat, respond to that initial threat, but also take pieces of that particular threat producing antigens. They take those antigens and present them to your adaptive immune system. Your adaptive immune system then provides a much stronger and more precise response to that particular pathogen. And so that entire cycle where your innate immune system responds, wakes up your adaptive immune system builds that response, and then produces the memory cells so that it can do a secondary response if they get exposed a second time. That entire process takes 2 weeks, approximately, give or take, depending on the person. So that's why you have to wait. That's why you have to have that 2-week period. Now, the reason why we have to have 2 doses or multiple doses when it comes to vaccines is it's because of that training process. So now you have the memory cell after your first shot. Those memory cells are able to recognize and build a response to the virus if they were to deal with that particular pathogen, if it were to come into the host. So in this case, it'd be us, right? And so if you then have the second shot, those memory cells then get activated and then build a response against the whatever cells end up expressing the spike protein, right? But as they're dividing, those progeny cells are also trying to perfect themselves more, right? They're going to go through further divisions and further processes that allow them to be even more precise and even more stronger to that particular threat. And so by having 2 doses, you're basically allowing your immune system to perfect its response to that particular pathogen.
Great. So throughout the pandemic, we've kind of started talking a lot about variants. So
Right.
I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit more about what variants are, and then specifically how the messenger RNA vaccines are working against variants?
A variant is essentially a virus that has one or more mutations from its previous iteration of that virus. So if you think about the original virus, the original SARS-CoV-2 that was found in Wuhan, all these variants result from separate mutations that occurred in individuals throughout this pandemic cycle. Now, each individual who ends up being infected with the virus is going to have their own separate mutations that occur because of the replication process. The replication process is not perfect. Every time the machinery of the cell is being used by the virus to produce more virus, mistakes can happen along the way. And those mistakes end up changing the genome of the virus. That change of the genome of the virus actually can help it sometimes. So sometimes the mutation that goes in can be bad and make the virus worse, which is better for us. Sometimes it makes no change. Sometimes it makes the virus better at either infecting people or infecting people or causing more damage. As a result, you have these, we've heard this term in the news, variants of concern, variants of interest. These variants are specific mutations that have arisen that have some kind of additional advantage compared to other viruses that people as us, the global world, are keeping an eye on because those particular mutations have led to some kind of advantage for the virus. And so how do the mRNA vaccines work against those variants? The idea of the trained immune response that we have with the 2 doses essentially allow the individual to build a response to that, to all the variants. The original vaccines were developed based on the original strain. Now, these mutations that allow the virus to be more advantageous, how can I say this? Right now, they're not as bad. They're still effective, right? Because again, the mRNA is specific to the original strain. That original strain is still relatively similar to the new strains that we have here, right? But as the virus continues to replicate more and more and more, there's going to be more and more chance where it becomes to diverge more from that original virus. As it starts to diverge more and more and more, the vaccines become less and less effective. So right now they're still effective because even though there are mutations that made it more advantageous for the virus to propagate and grow more and replicate, is just eventually we're going to get to a point where you heard the idea of boosters being used, right? And right now the mRNA vaccine is working fine because the coding that is being provided is good enough where it's still able to respond strongly to all the variants that are currently known, because it provides the genetic information, like I said earlier, genetic information to the cells to produce the spike protein so your immune cells can build a response. But as the virus continues to replicate in all of us, there's going to get to a point to where there's enough mutations to where the vaccine may not be as helpful. which is why we're trying to get the vaccines into as many people as possible, right? You try to limit the amount of people that the virus can grow freely within. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely makes sense, Duale. Thank you for that. And I think, to your point there at the end is really important, how some people might think about variants and think, well, if a variant's going to come up that the vaccine doesn't work for, why would I even get it? But the point of it is, to prevent the mutations from continuing on so that the vaccine
Exactly.
will work.
Exactly, right? The point being, right now the vaccines are working. Take advantage of it, that the fact that it's working right now. If we let it keep going, eventually there's going to get to a point where it's like, I don't know how to describe it, but eventually they're going to be right. But the question is, if it drags on long enough, yes, they will be right. There's going to be enough mutations. There's going to be a new strain that comes about that won't be as effective with these particular vaccines. But then we would have to modify the vaccine and develop those kind of boosters in the future. But right now they're working. And right now, if we get the vaccine into as many people as possible, then we prevent the virus from having more individuals to continue to grow, replicate, and possibly develop new strains. And so it's working now. We use it now so that we don't have to deal with that possible outcome in the future.
Yeah, very good point, Duale. I definitely appreciate that. I think it can scare some people, like the thought of the variants, but I think it's important to know that since we have the vaccine now, it's like we're on the right track now. If we hadn't have had one this whole time and these new variants had to rise, we would have been in more trouble than we are now, when we can reduce the amount of transmission because of the amazing vaccines that have been developed. So
Exactly.
yeah.
And all this work has been years and years in the making. It's not like this was made out of the whim. There have been decades and decades of work that has been done in the context of mRNA vaccines that have led to this point to where they can be used. And if we don't take advantage of it now, then eventually we're just going to be continue stuck for where we are right now. We're in this kind of purgatory where, do we go and live life as normal? Do we not live life as normal? Is the threat of the virus out there too big to where we just stay home and become hermits for the rest of our lives? You know what I mean? And if everybody does their part, follows their role in the concept that we have in this society, we can actually get through this. The question becomes is, are we willing to do what we need to do in order to get to the other side? Because eventually we'll get there. The question becomes, how do we get there and how many people do we lose getting there? And that's the sad part.
Yeah, very poignant point to make about that. So we definitely appreciate your answer there. We have another question here about mRNA vaccines. And the question is, how long does the mRNA vaccine last in your system? And how long it lasts affect your immunity? I know some people worry about like how, if it changes DNA or like how much it stays in there. So that's a good question to ask. Like, how long does it last in your system?
Absolutely. It's a very good question to ask. And the beauty of the mRNA vaccine is that it doesn't last very long, like it's in your body for a couple of days. So if you look about the stability of mRNA and DNA just in general, mRNA is a less stable genetic material compared to DNA. It degrades relatively quickly. This is why we end up storing the mRNA vaccines in very, very low temperatures. So these are in freezers that can go as low as -80, just to maintain them, preserve them so that we can get them into the arms of individuals, right? In addition, our cells develop these machinery within them, right? We have the central dogma of biology, right? DNA goes to mRNA, mRNA then goes to protein. We have machinery within the cell that regulate both the transcription process, the DNA to RNA, as well as the translation process, the RNA to DNA, where once the cell knows they have enough protein, they will degrade the mRNA immediately. And so that mRNA gets into your cells, uses the machinery, produces the protein, and then gets degraded by the cell machinery. Like, it's a natural process. It'll be there for a couple of days and that mRNA is gone. And then your immune cells take care of the cells that end up expressing that spike protein as a result. And then those cells are gone. throughout by the 2-week process. And so it's not there very long. And it's done in this particular way so that it builds your immune response. It goes away and your body's none the wiser.
Wow, yeah, that's really cool to hear. And I think it's interesting too, because a lot of people feel like vaccines are like an unnatural, like people argued like for natural immunity versus, unnatural vaccines. But really, vaccines are really just taking advantage of your totally natural immunity. It's not any different than how your normal cells work.
Absolutely. Like, I like to think of it like this, right? Imagine you're going into a test, right? You're studying all as hard as you can, trying to memorize all the material, trying to understand the material before you go into the test. The vaccines are essentially someone, as you're walking into the test, providing you the answers to it, just slipping it in your pocket without you knowing. You go to your desk, you're writing the exam, and you realize that piece of paper is in your pocket. Oh, these are the answers. Okay, cool. And you just write the answers down. That's what the vaccines are.
It's a
Would
cheat
you like to
code.
have the answers? Exactly. They are the cheat code.
Yeah.
And the other thing about vaccines is we've been playing with this idea of training our immune cells for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. Like, there have been studies, I don't remember how back, so I don't want to sound like I'm like a total expert here, but there have been work being done by there was the healing doctors of indigenous groups all around the world have used, say, the pus of individuals. Your pus usually contains your immune cells. Is usually, when you're infected, if you see you have pus where you're infected, like on your skin, for example, those pus represent your immune cells. They're white, they're foamy. Those are your immune cells responding to whatever infection that's in that particular site, right? Now, indigenous group have used that pus and put it back into individuals in order to build some set of immunity. That's been going on for centuries and centuries. And no, I'm not an expert at exactly how they did it and which particular groups actually did it. But the point being is this idea of training your immune cells and training your bodies has been around since centuries.
Yeah, I wasn't even aware of that. That's really cool to know for sure. Like, amazing that we've taken those really like long-standing ideas and used our tech to make them so accessible for people around the world and stuff like that. So that's really definitely cool. Interesting.
Exactly. And it goes back to that earlier thought, right? Yes, the natural infection, most people feel like, why don't we just do it naturally? We can get it out the way, just like how people used to treat the chickenpox before we had the chickenpox vaccine that came around, I believe it was in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. But the thing about COVID is there's other things rather than you just getting sick. You can get other people sick. And if you get sick enough, then you end up putting a burden on the healthcare system. That healthcare system isn't built to deal with hundreds upon hundreds of people in there at a time, at a single point in time. And so there's a greater good that comes with being vaccinated and getting the vaccine so that society can basically maintain itself or survive to the other end of this. But then you see what happens in institutions where that doesn't happen, or in jurisdictions where it doesn't happen. That the healthcare system gets burdened and burdened and burdened, and then other things that are required the healthcare system, like surgeries, emergency visits, all those things start to be pushed away because we have to deal with the immediate threat.
Yeah, definitely important to consider. And I'm really appreciate you being here today for this talk, because I've learned some stuff. It's illuminated a lot of things. And I think it's good for science students too, to kind of hear more of the scientific basis behind it, like you've talked about, because that allows us to be more knowledgeable and to share that knowledge with others in a really accessible way, like you did today. So thank you so much, Duale. We really appreciate it. And yeah, if you have any final thoughts, you can go ahead, but thank you.
Yeah, no, I was going to say thank you for having me here today. And hopefully I wasn't like a rambling mess going through the questions and everything like that. But I just want, if there's one piece of information that's someone were to take from this, is don't be afraid to ask questions. Just also be mindful of where you're getting that information from and why that particular place that you're getting the information from is giving the information in that way, right? You need to be open but discerning at the same time. And you notice with people, like, you can talk to friends about whatever topic it is, and you can tell when someone's actually listening to you and being open to you, and you can tell when they're not listening to you at all and they're just tuning you out. They're just letting you talk to get whatever stuff off your chest, right? If you truly want to discover and better understand what is happening in the context of the vaccine, the information is there. You just have to be both open and discerning about what information you're grabbing. And hopefully this has helped in that process.
I certainly think it has, and that's great advice. So thank you so much, Duale.
Yeah, thanks
very
again.
happy.
We really appreciate having you.
Yeah.
No problem. Again, hopefully I wasn't a whole blabbing mess, but